Good afternoon, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to this webinar on innovating the ways metrics are applied, responsible metrics, and measuring openness. My name is Charlotte Wien. I'm a professor of scholarly communication at the University Library of Southern Denmark. I also have the privilege of chairing one of LIBER's working groups, the Working Group on Innovative Metrics. We are a bunch of people working hard and intense on understanding and developing, but also disrupting the various metrics applied to measure researcher performances. I've had this honor and privilege chairing this working group for 1.5 years now, and the group is growing and we are still inviting new members. This is actually our first webinar, and I'm very, very proud to introduce our two prominent speakers today. Our first speaker will be Professor Isabella Peters from Kiel University. She has been a professor since 2013 of web science and library and information science. She works on user-generated content and are especially focused on social media environments and how social media content affects scholarly communication. It is truly a great honor and pleasure to have somebody like Isabella Peters with us today. Our second speaker is also a very distinguished speaker. I'm very happy to welcome Sarah Slowe, who is head of the Office for Scholarly Communication at the University of Kent. Sarah is supporting researchers to achieve best practices in research data management, public engagement, and open access, as well as helping researchers to raise their profiles on all academic outputs, build their research network, and maximize their research impact. With speakers like these two, I'm pretty sure we're going to have quite an interesting afternoon. The notes regarding the housekeeping. First of all, you should all be aware that this webinar will be recorded, and you will afterwards, all of those who have participated, receive a link to the recording. You will also be able to find the slides on Zenodo so that the slides you're seeing here will be available for you after this webinar. If you have questions on the way, please put your questions in the attendee chat. I will monitor the attendee chat while we go on with the presentations, and after both presentations, I will pick questions from the attendee chat and forward them to Isabella and to Sarah. So don't hesitate. If you have questions, just put them in the attendee chat, and we'll manage as many of the questions as we can when we're done with the presentation. We have a total of about 60 minutes ahead of us, meaning almost only 55 now, because I almost spent my 5 minutes of introduction already. So Isabella will have a presentation lasting 15 to 20 minutes, the same with Sarah, and then we'll add up the rest of the time with the questions from the attendees. So don't hold back any questions. Please, please, please send your questions on the attendee lists. Before I give the word to Isabella and to Sarah, I would also very much like to encourage those of you who are interested in joining our Innovative Metrics Working Group to check out what we do and how we work. You can see on this slide, you can see some of the areas that we prioritize in our work. And these areas are the areas suggested to us by LIBER members. You also see a link on this presentation slide where you can click on and get more information about who we are and how we work. So if you feel like joining us, don't hesitate, drop me or anybody else in the group a note. And with these words, I hope you are ready, Isabella.
Yes, I am.
It's all yours then.
Great. Then hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for this very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to give this webinar and to talk about measuring openness. That is a talk that builds on a presentation I have given earlier this year for the LISP Bibliometrics community, but I hope that you don't mind. So in the presentation, I will introduce various approaches to both quantitatively and qualitatively measure the state of openness in research. I will also try to discuss reasons that may motivate open science assessment frameworks and whether they tackle the concept of openness or what we understand from openness appropriately. I hope that at the end there's enough time to also answer your questions and to discuss the concept openness with you. So then let's start. How do we measure openness and why? Traditionally, when it comes to measuring scientific work, we can distinguish between indicators that are either concerned with the output or the performance or the structure of research. Performance indicators are called impact indicators too, and sometimes these are even considered to reflect the quality of scientific work. These indicators are built from quantitative information and allow you to take a bird's eye view so that you can get a deeper understanding of what is going on in scientific fields. And of course, you can start to compare all actors in the scientific enterprise, the researchers, the institutions, and whole disciplines, if not more. By looking up the literature on openness and open science, I noticed that the discussion does consider other factors for measuring openness too. And that is what you can see on the right-hand side. So it is possible to consider whether researchers do things openly, such as publishing open access or using open source software. That is something we can describe as process indicators. The other level which can be considered in the system is the system level and whether the framework conditions are available to be actually able to do open science. This is where policies and strategies come into play. For example, whether there are institutional policies that request research data management plans or that allow open practices to be counted for tenure decisions. All indicators that are mentioned here need some context and interpretation, even if they are represented by numbers or shares. It doesn't tell you very much if a researcher has 9 publications or 900 and what this means. Somehow you need the story around that number to understand what's going on with this particular researcher and whether that is a good one or not. And often comparisons help here. So let's see what was proposed in terms of measuring openness and how a comparison would become possible. A pragmatic approach to an output indicator now could be to take into consideration the open definition from the Open Knowledge Foundation and just count how many research products are equipped with the properties proposed in this definition. And this matches quite well with the concept of open science, since the open definition asks for scientific works, for example, to be published in the public domain or to be provided in machine-readable format. This is where another approach was thought to be of good help, actually. In the beginning of the open science movement, altmetrics or social media metrics were considered the perfect indicators to measure open science. And this is because they benefit from a greater variety in terms of types of engagement, in terms of research products, and in terms of stakeholders. They are able to make visible new forms of scholarly communication, to broaden our understanding of the multiple types of social impact of research, for instance, by mapping interactions of people and organizations, and to evaluate all influences of various types of scientific outputs and activities. And that is a quote I borrowed from the MLE, which is the mutual learning exercise on altmetrics. However, although altmetrics can offer this diversity of information and therefore may reflect a more nuanced picture of research outputs, their performance and their structure, often their quantitative nature is highlighted without taking much care of the context of the numbers. Because of that and because of other challenges those altmetrics face, such as their volatility, all experts recommended to not use altmetrics as sole indicators for open science. The hesitance in using such alternative metrics was also revealed by the European Mutual Learning exercise on metrics and rewards, as the quote on the slides show. So other types of measuring frameworks seem to be needed, and it was recommended to combine qualitative and quantitative information. The first example I would like to present for this type of measurement framework is the Open Science Career Evaluation Matrix, developed by a group of experts issued by the European Commission. The Open Science Career Evaluation Matrix, which I will now call OSCAM because it's shorter. So the OSCAM is a multidimensional approach to evaluate researchers through the lens of open science. The OSCAM incorporates broader aspects of being an excellent researcher, such as service and leadership, research impact, and contribution to teaching. The matrix, and that is only a part that you can see on the right-hand side, this matrix illustrates how these broader aspects could be taken into account in the context of recognizing researchers' contributions to open science. The criteria are often expressed as doing open science in order to highlight the process view we discussed in the slide before. This means that there's room for interpretation and that the evaluation might rather take the form of a narrative, and there will be no number for that. However, the matrix also includes indicators that consider performance or output of research and that could be translated into numbers. Because this matrix particularly aims at evaluating individual researchers, weighing or numbers can only be part of the process. Qualitative judgment must be the other part. However, this framework leaves open the question what is a good narrative or when a good level of openness would be achieved, because this all has to be explained in these kinds of narrative. That's why a second proposal come into play, and that was also developed by a group of colleagues that were commissioned by the European Commission to work on these kinds of open science indicators. And they found indicators for the different areas of both the scientific process, so the doing of open science, and the system level, that is the framework conditions that are necessary to be able to perform open science. And in contrast to the Open Science Career Evaluation Matrix, which we have seen on the other slide, they take the measuring a little bit more literal and propose a variety of countable items, such as the percentage of machine-readable data, and so on and so forth. And also this list would go on if you have a deeper look in this paper. With their inventory of indicators, they aim at measuring the uptake and impact of open science, as well as monitoring the progress towards open science. They also take into account how important a particular indicator can be for a specific stakeholder, for example, the researcher, the research funder, or the public. So they really try to address several levels here. So what we can say in this approach, numbers play a vital role to compare the performance of the different stakeholders. Similar goals are to achieve by the Open Science Monitor, which was also published by the European Commission last year. It overlaps to some extent with the work which we have seen on the last slide, but it also has some distinct features. However, the Open Science Monitor particularly aims at showcasing success stories, or maybe I should say success numbers of open science. For example, it visualizes the number of preprints archived in repositories. This monitor should support tracking of progress towards open science. But what may be more notable is that the design of this monitor particularly encourages comparisons. So you can look for disciplines, for countries, for funders, and so on. So when I came across all these models and frameworks that are trying to measure open science, I asked myself, why do we need all these comparisons and dashboards and numbers? Is it really what we would like to see? So why is it then that we have all these numbers, and why are we presented with these numbers? Well, and I came to the conclusion that it is that numbers or indicators are super incentives. Apparently, researchers love carrots and do everything to get them. And of course, they also do everything to avoid sticks. This is what both the EU's mutual learning exercise on altmetrics and rewards found out, as well as the expert group on altmetrics. Metrics and indicators are drivers of open science and should be integrated in the reward system of science. By rewarding researchers for behavior related to open science, appropriate indicators are believed to be the best way to promote open science. Also, the European group that was concerned with the evaluation of research careers fully acknowledging open science practices recommended these sticks and carrots. They say that there should be a system in place that drives the virtuous cycle summarized in the figure in the context of open science. Harmonization of recognition and reward of researchers with basic aims of open science is a necessary condition for promoting research excellence. So I guess I'm done here with my presentation and talk. So you know now several ways to measure openness and why it is important to measure this openness, don't you? So but maybe then let me ask another question. What if the open science indicators are all completely fulfilled? I mean, the neat thing about open science process indicators is that they can sum up to 100%. You can reach 100% of open publications and open methodology and so on. This almost never happens with the other indicators, such as the number of publications or number of citations. But with the open science process indicators, you can reach the ultimate goal of having 100% openness. But what then? Are we done with open science then? Can we check this from our list somehow, and do we have to stop our working group? And I would say, to a certain extent, the answer may be yes. Open science practices are standard, and we got what we wanted, so we can be happy. But why is it then that this conclusion seems to be not making the right point? I think it is because we have asked the wrong questions. Do the many indicators developed, whether it's a number, a share, or a more qualitative narrative, really represent what we mean by openness? Is openness in the process really the only thing we want to achieve? Or let me put it differently, do they really matter what matters? Do they really measure what matters, as the expert group on altmetrics has requested for the next generation metrics for open science? So what does openness really mean to us? It is often stated that open science increases the quality of science and its efficiency. Openness will make science more reproducible, and it helps science gaining in credibility. It will promote integrity of research and engagement. And of course, openness increases the visibility of research, which can be quantified in citation numbers or tweet numbers in the end. There are other proposed benefits of open science, of course, but I haven't seen much discussions or approaches and indicators that are seriously taking these aspects, which you can now see on the slide, into account. Of course, some people may argue that by doing open science, science automatically becomes more reproducible or more credible. But I doubt that this is where we really want to end with the open science movement. I propose to take a different approach and start from the goals we want to achieve with open science, with what we can accomplish by sharing our work as researchers, instead of starting from the research products and counting how many of them have reached the state of openness or that were produced in an open manner. So I would like to ask you what you think what openness really mean to us. Do the proposed indicators really measure what matters? What matters anyway? What behavior or output would be important to incentivize in terms of openness? What is it what you would like to see? And do different stakeholders need different incentives? And would different stakeholders set up different incentives if we have to construct a new reward system? So I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions after Sarah has given her talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very, very nice and very, very interesting presentation, Isabella. I see we already have some questions coming up on the attendee chat. Please keep them coming, and we'll put them together by the end. So thank you very much, Isabella. And I think we are ready now for your presentation, Sarah. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your introduction earlier. So as Charlotte mentioned, we're part of the LIBER working group on metrics, and the last point on the priorities about explaining to management why metrics fluctuate is the one that I'm particularly working on. And when we started talking to people about how they felt about explaining that to management and what guidelines would be helpful, people kind of said, well, why would management want to know? And if management do want to know, why would they talk to us? And if they did want to talk to us, what would we tell them? So this presentation builds on something that I spoke about at the Innovative Libraries in the Digital Era conference last year, that Charlotte was at, to talk about what are responsible metrics and why do management, especially in research institutions, matter. Firstly, a little bit about me. So I am the head of the Office for Scholarly Communication at Kent, which is quite an unusual thing. I have a dual line report, so I work both inside the library and inside research services. So that gives me both the experience of the library research support team, working with metrics in terms of finding collaborations and finding research, but also with research services in measuring impact and measuring the contribution that our research makes to the world. So I kind of join those two attitudes to the same numbers up in one office. So firstly, why metrics for research evaluation? So if we go way back to things like journal impact factor, they were created for a very specific purpose, to be able to show which journals were attracting the most citations, so that libraries had some indication when they were looking at how to spend their budgets. But as soon as numbers are available, it's very easy to say, latch onto those and say, right, well, this is a number that shows things are good. And so when you can see, management like numbers, and they like numbers that start and they increase and they get bigger and they get steadily bigger. But we know, firstly, that's not the case for metrics. And secondly, that wasn't the purpose that they were originally designed for. Leaving aside the discussion of whether they met those original design purposes, measuring the quality of research based on pure numbers is a very contentious issue. And using numbers that were designed for something else inappropriately causes all sorts of slightly odd behaviour. So why metrics for research evaluation? Firstly, they're straightforward. So the picture of the dragon on the slide was from my then 5-year-old's homework. It's easy. He could tell 10 is less than 35, 16 is bigger than 14. We know that, we understand that. The trouble is that numbers outside of their context, as Isabella said about the story around the numbers, give a different impression. So looking at the next example on the slides, you've got which 3 are we talking about? A 3 may be good in the first example or bad in the second example. But out of the context, a 3 is just a 3. And unless we tell the story around it and the context in which that number sits, you can't make a judgment about it. Secondly, the problem with targets. So many institutions are ranked. We have targets on us as an institution to increase citations, increase the reach of our research, to evidence our research quality. And it's straightforward to evidence that with numbers. So we can say last year we had 100 citations, this year we have 115 citations, we must be doing better. But the trouble with targets is, first, they don't show the variance. So if we're saying we want to increase our citations and we do one really awful piece of research, then that piece of research may get an awful lot of citations because people need to cite that to say this is not the case. My piece of research shows that this is completely defunct. But equally, if we say to people that we're aiming for a certain level of citations or a certain reach for our publications, we ignore that we're actually trying to enable our research to change the world. We're doing that research for a reason, and we want excellent, high quality research that makes a difference to the people that need it. And that might mean publishing in particular places. It may mean publishing in particular languages. It may not mean publishing at all. If you're working with a group that doesn't read English, then publishing in an academic journal in English is a very unhelpful way of disseminating that research. So if you have targets that are measuring an increase in numbers, it can lead to perverse researcher behaviour. So we've seen an increase in self-citation, in citations within journals, citations within research groups. And there is an element of that that's natural in a very niche field. There will be considerably more citation among a small group of people. But what we don't want is people to be getting reviews back saying, well, you should cite these people because they're publishing in our journal, which is feedback that we get from our researchers. So what are institutions doing? There's a variety of approaches. I've put some of the main ones here. So the LIBER manifesto are 10 principles that researchers worked on together for using metrics responsibly. And that includes things like setting, recognising the value in local language publication, recognising what metrics do and don't measure, recognising the value in locally relevant research. The San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment is one that's quite popular because you actually sign it. There's a website, and institutions can have their deputy vice chancellor, whoever, to sign and say that this institution commits to the principles in the San Francisco Declaration, which includes things like not judging research output on its place of publication. The Metric Tide was a publication that came out just after the REF exercise in the UK, which is a big, a national exercise that recognises the quality of our research in several units of assessment. And the final one is an individual policy. So saying, actually, all of these things have good elements in and the things that we want to do, but we want to make a policy that's relevant to our institution and meets the needs of our research institution. Many of those go beyond the international statements. Then implementing those is really well to say we have a responsible metric statement and we're going to use those numbers in context, but looking at different ways that they can be implemented. So these are some of the ways that we've implemented them at Kent and in some of the other LIBER members groups. Looking at target setting, and that's both in a target and a KPI way. So sometimes you may have a target that says we want to increase citations. Sometimes it might be more nuanced than that, and it says we want to increase the excellence of our research, and then when the sole KPI for that is by increasing citations. Evaluation of individual pieces of research. So that's where we're looking at a piece of research and making judgments about it based purely on numbers rather than on the research and where it was done and how it was done and what it shows. Something that we have done at Kent is that we have rewritten our promotions procedure in line with the principles in the LIBER manifesto. So we hadn't got any explicit statement that metrics would be used, but we'd found an emerging culture where researchers were putting metrics in inappropriately to evidence that their work was high quality. And we've stepped away from that. We've made explicit statements about how we expect the publications and research outputs to be reflected across our promotions criteria, recognising the different career stages of our researchers and recognising the different forms of output across the institution, including things like performances and sculptures that won't attract metrics in the same way as a science-based article would. Equally, we're looking at hiring, making sure that we're not having any job descriptions or adverts that require certain levels of 8 index or certain numbers of publications in particular journals. And that's something that we'll continue to doing. It takes much longer to do that kind of top-down approach. The most important thing, and I think there's quite a lot of places that have implemented the responsible metric statements that focus on training, because in the training you give researchers the power to respond when metrics are used about their work, you give the information that promotions panels, that hiring panels need in order to make appropriate judgments about work. I can talk more about those in the questions. And equally, if people have questions that are specific to their institution that they'd like to raise, but not in a public forum, I'm happy for people to email me afterwards. So we've come up with 4 tools for explaining research metrics to management. Proactive engagement is going to them because it's better to have a relationship before the numbers go down, rather than coming to someone and trying to explain the situation that's arisen. Education, so explaining to them a positive approach, what management can do. And then at the end of the slides, there's a whole list of resources that could be relevant. So proactive engagement is if management know in advance that the metrics they're using are going to fluctuate, and they may fluctuate for very good reasons, then it's better than being told afterwards, than having numbers coming down and it feel like you're making excuses. Isabella already touched on this, but measure what matters. So just because we want to achieve something doesn't mean that we need to find a number to evidence that. There may be other ways of evidencing that. And if something is measurable, that doesn't necessarily mean it's something that we want to achieve. Good practice is sustainable. So lots of things that we can do. There's a lot of things in terms of making work open, which we'll come on to a little bit later in education. But it may be that there's a short-term dip. It may be there's a couple of years dip as you retract from these previous positions. But in the longer term, it will increase the amount of reach that your work is having because you're aiming at the most appropriate audience. Finally, highlighting expertise is going to management and saying, actually, in my office, in this area, we have expertise on why these numbers are appropriate, what they do, how they're measured, how they're calculated, and how they're likely to be affected in the future. So we had a recent challenge where in a data set that we used was suddenly increased. So of course our citations went up because there was more information in the database. And the Deputy Vice Chancellor came to us and said, well, hang on, why is this increased? Because we can't see anything that's happened, and we had that expertise to be able to explain what had caused this. Education is something that can be done at any stage with anyone. These are just a few kind of highlights from training that I do. So the image on the left, it's very easy to tell how much the vegetables weigh, but you can't tell how much the lemon weighs. And that's an image that researchers come back to me again and say that's the thing they remember most about the talks, is that judging something on where it's published or how it's published doesn't necessarily tell you anything about that thing in itself. So using metrics such as journal impact factor to show the quality of the research, it doesn't have a necessary follow through. The 2 images of the lakes, it's about context. It's saying where do these numbers fit? So the image on the left is our campus duck pond. The image on the right is the Great Lakes. Finally, the hydrographs. We know that research accrues citation, attention at different rates. You need a spike in the news. We know that when things are topical, they'll receive more attention, irrelevant of how recently they've been published. And if you look at the graph on the left, if you measured it at the first notch, you would say that that was a far more successful research output than looking at the second. And being aware that not every discipline follows those same trajectories. Different research becomes relevant at different times. It accrues citations and attention at different rates. And you can't make judgments on the quality of that research at particular times. So what management can do. This is the approach we found most helpful. It's very easy to say to people, you can't do this, you can't do that. But this looks at, firstly, data quality. So using things such as ORCID to identify who your researchers are, making sure that they are distinguished from people with the same name. So we have a Professor Bob King who works in our School of Anthropology, And he is the most strong proponent of ORCID because he has been credited with publications across all kinds of disciplines. And by having one ORCID, it says, this is who I am and these are my publications. Making sure that Scopus Web of Science, Google Scholar, whichever databases accurately reflect your work. So we had a massive increase in our data, and that was down to some work that our research impact team did just on cleansing Scopus, making sure that everybody who works at Kent was associated with Kent. And finally, single and archive copies. So we encourage researchers to share their work all the time. We're not very good about telling them how. And one of the things we found is that by telling researchers to share a link either to the archival copy in our institutional repository or to the publisher's version of an output, we've stopped having multiple copies on ResearchGate, on academia.edu, spread around. So when they're looking at those metrics, they come back to two different places. It's either been downloaded from the publisher's site or it's been downloaded from our academic repository. And when it comes to things like showing that their work has been accessed by people, it's much easier to see on the publisher's site or on our repository than it is to download from all the academic social networking sites. Making the output open access. Isabella already talked about open, accruing more citations, but we say as soon as possible, so whether that's preprint, whether it's green or gold open access, just as soon as it's possible. And again, depending to disciplinary norms, so economics, you'd have working papers from a very early stage. In psychology, we have pre-registration. It may be, say, in more humanities disciplines, it may not be able to be open access until the green copy comes out of embargo in a couple of years' time. But even then, we would say do the best that you can with this output. Encourage open references and open data in articles. Another thing for management is to have a specific contact, to be able to say, when I have queries about this, who do I talk to? How do I, because we find people who are making big strategic decisions don't necessarily have time to go hunting through a university directory to find out who it is they need to talk to. If they know who it is and who to come to, then they'll drop an email to you. And even if it's not relevant, even if there's a better person to talk to, it's easier to pass that on. Finally, compare apples with apples, but if you want fruit salad, don't only water the apple trees. If you want to keep that diversity and inclusive and interdisciplinary research environment, then you need to have measures that value all of the research. And then I'm just nearly out of time, but just the final slide. Here's a list of resources, a link to the LIBER manifesto, the metrics toolkit, which demonstrates, it gives a whole load of different metrics and how they can be used. And then a few links to LIBER reports. So thank you.
Thank you to you too, Sarah. What a nice presentation. I think we are just about able to move to the questions, and I see that questions are coming in quite rapidly at the moment. So maybe I should just start from the first question and then move on to the questions that are coming in now. The first question was posed by Elizabeth Gatt, who says, and this is a question for Isabella, as far as I understand it, OSCAM has not been implemented by any institutions yet. Why do you think this is? What could make it more adoptable? And this is for Isabella.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie. Good to see you on this channel as well. Now you suffered from hearing this presentation several times, but you are always coming up with good questions. So, and I really don't know what is the problem with this OSCAM. I assume that, and you are right, I haven't heard of any institution that really tried to adopt this matrix. Maybe it's because of they don't know about this yet, because I just checked the website from the European Commission. And it still says that the report is going to be discussed by the Open Science Policy Platform. So I guess there's a little bit of lack of advertisement. But on the other hand, and that is what I'm also maybe, that's what I also criticize with this matrix, is it might be too complicated or so. There are many good ideas in it, and I think this matrix can serve well as a checklist for thinking about what openness can entail and how openness can be reflected in research practices. So that is really an exhaustive list. But when it comes to the decision, or like filling out this matrix and then coming to the decision whether whether a certain amount of open practices is good or not, then this whole matrix might not be that worthwhile. And as we know, and that's also why these numbers, or why we are still suffering numbers, I would say, numbers are so easy to interpret. I mean, Sarah has shown that numbers can also be very difficult to interpret, but they feel more easy to interpret. And that's, I think, the matrix makes very clear that work has to be done to fill it in and to also interpret what you want to see. And maybe that is the more important part. You need to know in advance for what aspects you should look, right? So you need to know before you apply this matrix, what is it you really like? What is it you want to see? What is it what openness means to me or to you? And I guess that is the workload which many people rather avoid.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Tiberius Ignat, who's actually one of our working group members as well. Nice to see you here, Tiberius. Tiberius is asking both of you, and maybe I should ask Sarah to answer first. How much the matter if responsible research indicators is a technical matter? Create them, use new technologies to implement them as part of quiz systems, etc., or a cultural matter to convince researchers, funders, and company to invest enough efforts, make the necessary compromises, build decisions, and adopt the new family of metrics? And that's a long one. Sarah?
I think it's both, but I think in my role in particular, it's cultural. I'm not technical, I'm not a developer. So for me, the cultural aspect is naturally more important. I work with researchers, I work with research managers, I work with librarians, and then we work out into the publishers and funders environment. So for me, the cultural aspect is more important because that's where my influence is and where I can make a difference. But I think if we don't have both, then it would be a very difficult thing to change long term.
And Isabella, your take on this?
To be honest, I think that it's not a technical issue at all, because all the altmetrics indicators are built up just because the data is available and because it's technically possible to build indicators. So I think that is not the problem, but changing the cultural system, the belief system and everything, that is more complicated. So I think we should invest in that a little bit more. And after that, it will be easy to construct the indicators.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Justine Fabre. How can an institution have a single platform for their research data? We can never make the editors hide their data in order to push ours instead, or maybe I misunderstood? I think this question is for Sarah, but I'm not quite sure.
Well, I'll answer. We wouldn't have a single platform for research data. We would say the same with research data as we say with any other research output, put it in the most appropriate place possible, whether that's a publisher place, whether that's a discipline database, whether that's a funder database. We would help make that decision, but we wouldn't tell them where to put their research data. But what we would say is make that data open if it's possible. So within the FAIR guidelines, if it is, if you have a research output, make the underlying basis from which you drew your conclusions open as well. Because if that data is open, it's more likely that the research can be shown to be robust.
Right. Thank you. Adnan Nadil is asking you, Sarah, as well. Hold on a second. Would national research assessments exercises like REF in the UK impact the way research is produced? Too robust application of the metrics inevitably starts shortlisting the research, which might be opposite to open research. And
wow,
that's for Sarah as well.
That's like a whole webinar in its own question. So I'll try and, yes, the REF affects how we produce research in the UK, because we know how we're going to be measured, and there's if you as an institution are going to be measured in these ways, then you as an institution put pressure on departments to produce research in certain ways, and you as a department put pressure on researchers to produce research in certain ways. I wouldn't necessarily say that all of the changes that the REF makes are bad. So the REF has been one of the main drivers for open access to articles and conference proceedings, because we have very detailed conditions on how our work is to be made open access. The types of embargo periods we have, the types of licenses we could have. So, and then when it comes to the REF, only very particular disciplines and panels will use metrics as part of the assessment of quality. So it's not universal across every discipline or subject area. And the REF, Research England, UKRI, which is the governing body, are signed up to the principles of responsible metrics. So yes, it does impact the way research is produced. Yes, too robust application of metrics might discourage open research, but actually taken as a whole picture, that isn't how it works.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add something, because I've read the last question a little bit differently. I just want to make sure that it's clear that it's not either openness or good quality research. They can be both.
That's a good point, Isabella. Yes, thank you. Marcus Israelson is asking both of you, and maybe I suggest that Isabella starts answering this. Institutions have many aspects to take into account when setting up promotion, hiring, publishing policy, economic interest in particular. Does it only require boldness and courage to make the leap towards more responsible practices, or do we have other arguments for how different practices will positively affect us in the short term? Isabella?
I have a little bit difficulties of understanding this question and to what or for which target group this should hold. So who should be bold? If it's the professor or the students or the applicants.
Could be management.
Could be management. Yeah. Yeah, I know that both. So
he says Marcus answers management now. He means management. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Of course. So it's a complicated field, and the thing is that management always has to. Well, they manage, and they often do it with KPIs or with indicators, so they get an indicator of what is going on. But having an indicator is just one piece of information you should take into account, and it's not like the only information which is helpful. That is what Sarah told us in her presentation. And my assumption is that that management again doesn't really know what they want to achieve with the institution, if they don't know what the vision is, if they don't know what are the values that are standing behind the institution, then it's of course difficult to find the right indicators or to to set the right incentives. But so you have to work on these kinds of values, or the vision, or the strategy you want to see. What is the impact? If I can borrow this term, what is the impact the institution should do? Then they can come up with some kind of strategies and incentives and indicators. And of course, they should take the opinions of the people that are managed also into account. And that makes it difficult because the goals of the management might be different from the goals that the researchers have. We all know that. But I guess the only way is to start a discussion here and talk about it, and then agree on certain rules. And I truly believe that the executors of science and the managers of science can agree on certain values they both want to follow. And that is what I hope. That is what I hope with this whole open science debate, that we can rethink how we would like to pursue science in the future.
Thank you. And your take on this, Sarah?
I think we have a lot of arguments for it. So it's not about saying responsible practices requires boldness and courage so much as saying, actually, we want to encourage an interdisciplinary research environment. We want to encourage an environment where research can have global reach. We want to encourage an environment that has a diversity of research outputs. And to do that, we just need to be sure that we're not going off in a different direction. I think a lot of the conversation is not about saying we have to change who we are. We're just saying, by measuring this, we're putting an emphasis that we don't want. This is who we are as an institution. How do we evidence and protect that? So, for example, if you are hiring someone and you say, well, at least they must have at least 7 research papers, that immediately excludes quite a lot of very research active people that are working in industry, that will bring other skills and talents into a department that actually you may want more than you need those 7 papers. So it's talking to people on those levels, like what are they trying to achieve, and is this actually what will achieve that for them? On a very basic note, if you need 5 papers for the ref, then maybe that is the complete requirement of the job. But that's a very unusual way of looking at a long-term research environment.
Thank you. And then there's a question from Tamara Pianos asking you, Sarah. You mentioned that one researcher is pushing ORCID. Are all researchers at Kent fond of creating their own ORCID ideas? Is there a push by the university to go forward with ORCID, or is it more of an individual interest?
So there is a push. We have a mandate as an institution that as a researcher, you will have an ORCID. It links into funding applications. It links into our repository system. It links into all sorts of things. And we say to researchers, you should have one. It's that he is particularly enthusiastic because he publishes as so many different names, and it's quite a common name. It's made a real benefit for him. And so he can really see a case for doing it. Increasingly, as ORCID is implemented across more systems, more researchers are finding uses for it. We have single sign-on authentication with ORCID. So to log into your ORCID account, you log into your normal Kent institutional account. So we have reduced the problem of researchers creating multiple ORCIDs, which I know some institutions are struggling with. But yes, we have a university mandate to do it.
But do researchers in general resist it, or are they okay with it?
Generally, they're okay. I think it's the conversations we have are more people that haven't got round to it than people that are against it. And we start with our postgraduate students, and they can see an immediate benefit for themselves because they've never used any other institutional email addresses. They don't have 40 years of publishing history where they've used their name at on things that aren't available digitally. So they're very used to this kind of standard. I shall have an ORCID and I will submit with my ORCID, and it makes my life a lot easier. We're working on a kind of middle group, but as more systems use it, it will become necessary to have one.
Okay. I think we are approaching the end. We only got 5 minutes left, but there's still a question from Tiberius Ignat, and I think it's directed to both of you. So I suggest that Isabella starts answering it. And Tiberius, right, we all know that most of research stakeholders are measured, researchers, support organizations, libraries, etc., publishers and others. But I'm not aware if research funders are measured. What is the knowledge opinion of the speakers?
Yeah, good question. I'm also not completely sure whether funders are measured. I think there is some kind of approach now with the dimensions database, because they also prominently prominently put the information on research funders into their data, and so they also display it, and then maybe having it visible, being able to access it, that may help putting on the evaluation glasses, basically. So there might be something. I know that funders, of course, are using all these kinds of bibliometrics and bibliometrics data for trend detection, for example, and of course they want to see how effective their spending was. So that is what I know. And I'm sure that they have to do some kind of reporting, but I'm not sure how visible this is or how transparent this is. It might be a little bit different for the funding coming from the European Union. No, they are always quite quite open about their or what they fund. But whether there's a real quality assessment or whatever kind of assessment for the funders, I don't really know. Maybe Sarah knows?
My feeling on that is that the funders have to justify their spending to someone, whether that's a kind of government organisation or whether that's a charity board. At some level, they have to show that the money they're spending is being spent responsibly. I don't think that they're measured in a way that you could make a comparison between Cancer Research UK and Research England. I'm not quite sure where the question's going with that, but I think pretty much anybody has to justify where that money is being spent. And I think there's, even with the big funders, they have to justify up to the government, this is how we've spent your money, this is why we need this budget, this is what change that your spending has brought, which is why then it's passed down to grant holders or institutions to say, this is what we've contributed to this.
Right. All right. We got 2 minutes left. I want to thank all the attendees. When there were most of us, we were almost 100 attending this session. And I suppose that was because we had so dignified speakers. Thank you to Sarah and thank you to Isabella for the wonderful presentations and for their clear answers to all the attendees' questions. I'd also like to thank the LIBER office for setting up this webinar, and of course Giannis, who is in charge of the working group under LIBER's communications section. So thank you very much to all of you, and I hope that we'll be able to welcome you to another webinar on innovative metrics not before long. Thank you.